In this video, we'll be talking through a strategy that will help you constructively engage in conflict. Conflict is an inevitable part of any workplace. And for most people, our natural tendency is to view conflict as a negative experience, one that is likely to result in stress and to actually damage relationships. Therefore, it is very common for people to try and avoid it. And yet, when approached in the right manner, it is actually possible for conflict to be highly constructive. Once we've experienced this side of conflict, it becomes easier to reframe it as an opportunity to address important issues and actually build relationships. In suggesting how you might do that, I'm going to draw on the wisdom of Marshall Rosenberg and Thomas Gordon, both of whom were clinical psychologists and pioneers in their approaches to conflict. I'm going to suggest a 4-part process that incorporates insights from both of them. And if you've listened to the previous lesson, you'll notice some similarities between this and the process of advocacy inquiry. At this stage, we'll outline the process in isolation. And then later on in chapter 3, we'll look at ways we can incorporate it into a broader conversation. To give the process some context, let's say you're working with a particular colleague who has spoken to you in a way that you've perceived as criticism. Maybe it's happened in front of some junior staff earlier in the day. You found it humiliating and basically you didn't like it. And you'd like to have a conversation with your colleague about that in the hope of ensuring that this doesn't happen again. Part 1. Voice your observation of the other person's behavior. The key thing here is to separate out any evaluation from your observation. Just stick to the raw data of what you observed.
When you gave me that feedback this morning in front of the junior staff.
Part 2. Express how you felt in that context. The key here is to make sure you're voicing an actual feeling.
I felt confused.
Now, there is real vulnerability in being this honest, but that is also where the power of this method resides. It can be extremely disarming to be spoken to in this way, and it will help move the other person into a receptive rather than a defensive mode. The danger that many people fall into is that they turn this feeling statement into a judgment or an opinion.
I felt like you were being mean. I think it was completely inappropriate.
These are not statements about feelings. They're opinions, and they carry the risk of moving the other person into a defensive mode. Part 3. Link your feeling to the cause of that feeling. Now, Rosenberg's take on this is that this element is best framed in terms of an unmet need that you identify in yourself. Gordon, on the other hand, puts emphasis on the use of I statements. For example, in this scenario, I might identify an unmet need in the domain of status. Specifically, I might fear a loss of respect or standing in the eyes of the junior staff who observed this interaction earlier today.
Because I worried that it might cause the junior staff to lose respect for me.
Now, it's really important to notice the difference between this statement and
because you made me out to be incompetent in front of the junior staff.
In the first statement, known as an I statement, you retain responsibility for your feelings, an approach that is likely to keep the other person open and responsive to your needs. The second statement, known as a you statement, sounds like an accusation and is more likely to trigger the other person into shutting down and close them off to a resolution that would satisfy your needs. Part 4. Make a specific request. This is an appeal to the other person to change their behavior.
In the future, would you be willing to wait till we're in private before you give me feedback?
Now compare this to,
look, you need to do better in future, okay?
The first example is clearly a request for a specific change, whereas the second is more of a demand and is completely non-specific in terms of what we might be seeking from them. I actually think the phrase,
would you be willing,
is an incredibly powerful tool in this situation, as it is a non-threatening way of framing a request, and it seems like something that would be easy and safe for the other person to agree to. So if we wanted to summarize this whole process, it might sound something like,
I felt because I worried that, would you be willing?
Before finishing up, I do want to acknowledge that this approach can be incredibly challenging to adopt, especially in the heat of the moment. The pitfalls I've described are very real and they are very easy to fall into. as you're learning to apply this new technique, I recommend always having these conversations in private and delaying them until sometime after the incident that triggered the problem. This will allow you a bit of time for your emotions to settle and to prepare your thoughts so that you can express them clearly. As I mentioned earlier, we'll look at some concrete examples for how we might apply this technique into a broader conversation later in the course.